All right, so for the next 20 to 30 minutes, I'm going to talk your ear off about input masks, which is a UX pattern I really like. And so I hope you can join me on this journey. So as Ben said, I'm Divya Sasidharan. I am a developer advocate at Netlify. How many of you use Netlify currently? Yay, that's a lot of hands. Awesome, so I don't have to go into much detail, but Netlify essentially champions the Jamstack, which is a modern way of building your web applications. The idea is to decouple your front and your back end, and Jam stands for JavaScript API and Markup. It's like a fun term for it. And if you'd like to know more about Netlify, the products we offer, and more about Jam, I guess, you can talk to me. Two of my lovely coworkers are here. We have a booth outside, so come find us. We have stickers, fun swag, and so on. And so before we dive into the implementation details of an input mask, I want to define what an input mask is to begin with. So if you've ever worked with a form, whether that be filling it out or building it, you might have come across this pattern. If there's credit card information requested or phone number, you might see the spacing or like particular brackets or dashes that are added as you're typing in. That is an input mask. This is an example of a currency input mask. So as you're typing, the last 2 digits are your cents, and everything before that is dollars. Here's another example of an input mask, if that one wasn't enough. This one isn't as clear that it's an input. It's kind of hidden stylistically. But you see the same idea. As you're typing, you see that semantic change. So commas for separating thousands, and then you see the cents kind of like up and to the left, I guess right. And input mask is a really key pattern for forms because it makes it really readable. It makes users able to understand what they're doing without making errors. And if you're still not convinced that it's a good pattern, I like to defer judgment to Chris Coyer, none other than Chris Coyer of CSS Tricks. And based on his anecdotal experience and the fact that he likes it, I would consider this a proof pattern that you should consider using in your applications. And so as we're diving through, I like to think about this in a strategic manner. We're going to talk about input events, so event listeners and handlers, because we are dealing with an input, an HTML input. Then we'll move on to how Vue can be used to implement the input mask itself, so reactivity, methods, computers, and so on. Then lastly, we'll talk about how we can use what we've learned to make our patterns more reusable. So we'll return to the first example, which is just an input with maybe some placeholder. And we're going to try to build an input mask, which in this case is a currency mask. And so because we're agile developers, we have some requirements, so we know exactly what we're trying to build. Because we're dealing with currency, we want to allow only numbers because you can't really represent currency in any other forms, I guess. Maybe like a prefix, but for now we're only dealing with numbers. And then we also want to make sure that formatting is added. So the commas for 1,000 separators, which is a very, like, I guess American, some other places use different kinds of separators. And then cents is decimal points. So those are the 2 requirements that we'll use to build our input mask. So fairly straightforward. So input events. There are key parts of an input event, which is key events. It's kind of confusing. But when I say key event, I mean whatever you're typing on a keyboard. There's always an associated event with that. So here's our input that I showed earlier. I'm going to clear out the placeholder so you exactly see what's happening. So if a user types, I want to grab whatever is within that and then propagate it through. So I'm formatting it or I'm validating it and so on. In the browser, to do this, there is a way. It's quite straightforward. You use an onInput, which is a very vanilla JS way of doing it. In Vue, you can easily use a directive. It's an @input, which is essentially the same thing. And so if you were to write your input, you have an input, and then you have these 2 properties, essentially. A value, which is a data property, and then you have that @input directive, which maps to a specific method. And so because we're Vue developers, and you might already be ahead of me here, but a V model can be used. Because a V model is just an @input and a value. It gives you reactivity out of the box, so you don't have to do the work yourself. So here we have it in a single file component. We have our V model with the data property formatted cash money, and everything is fine and dandy. Except we don't have a mask. We have no way of grabbing the specific input as it happens and then updating it. And so tuxedo mask is very sad. And so let's go back to what we had earlier. And we're gonna go back to using @input and value. So we are grabbing the specific input event as it happens, and then we can format it as needed. So the method is what we're gonna use. So this is the data property, formatted cash money, and then the method is format cash money, which formats that data property. So far, so good. So now we can talk about the specific requirement that we need now that we have the specific input. We want to allow only numbers. To do that, we would need to grab a key event or a character code associated with that key event. So when you type, you want to be like, is this a number, is this a character, or whatever. And in the browser, the API to do that is e.key. There's various ways you can do it. You can use character code, you can use key code, or char code and key code. E.key is really nice because you don't have to remember numbers associated. So for instance, a decimal point is 190, and you kind of have to remember that for validation, which is annoying. But e.key gives you actually what the value is. So a decimal will give you a decimal as a string. So with that, we can create some regex, which don't get too hung up here, but all we're doing is checking that it is not a decimal place or is not a number. So if it is not a number, we want to prevent that event from propagating, because ultimately, if a non-number is typed in, that is not valid currency. So here's a really quick demo of how it looks. We're gonna go into the Vue Dev Tools. Hopefully everybody can see that. And then we have our first input, which is our validate. And so what we're trying to show is that as you're typing in, numbers show, which is great. But for some reason, alphabets show as well. And so that validation doesn't work as we want it to. And in order to understand why, it's key for us to understand how key events or event listeners are propagated. So we're currently binding to the input event. And at input, the browser doesn't care anymore about the character code associated with that input because it doesn't matter. At input, value matters, and that's about it. And so in order to get that character code or that specific key to do validation, we'll go a couple steps back to key down. And that should give us access to the specific key that we want to validate. So instead of at input, we'll use a key down, which again is a directive accessible in Vue, and then we can do formatting for that. This is gonna keep. Cool. So we have our separate component, and then on key down, I'm gonna open Keycaster. So you see that I'm typing in numbers. If you see in the bottom left, that's number, like alphabets. And then if I type in a number, it works, which is great because that shows that we're using the correct directive here. And so the next requirement is to make formatting possible, so dollars and cents. So we'll go back to our event, and specifically our method. Now that we've done validation, we can format it. So we have a data property, formatted cash money, and we're gonna add a mask to it. So this is the part where I'm gonna go into a lot of code. So like, again, don't get hung up. I will post the slides so you can look at it and critique my code if you really want to. And so ultimately what's happening is I'm creating this where mask util function. And where mask is just decimalizing my string and separating it by thousands. So the decimalize function just checks to see whether or not the number string is of length 1 or less. And then if it is of length 1, it will just do a 0.0 and then append the number to the end. And if not, it does a substring where it takes like the first characters and then the last two, and then it puts them together with a decimal in the middle. So it just like, essentially takes the last two characters and then puts a decimal between whatever's before and after. And then separate by thousands is this awesome regex that I wrote. Again, like not gonna go into detail, but it's just grabbing every third or every 3 characters from the end, because that's how thousands places work, because math. And so what we're doing now with where mask is we're gonna decimalize the number and then we're gonna separate that by thousands. So that is essentially what's happening. So visually, for those of you who are visual people like me, this is what it looks like. Say you type in a number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 5, 6 is the cents, 2, 3, 4 is the thousands, and so you put in the decimal between the 4 and the 5, and then you put a comma between the 1 and the 2. Okay, we're gonna skip this because that's, okay. So then with key down, all is good. 1 sec. So as we're typing in, this is the formatted input on key down. And we notice that as we're typing in, the formatting does not happen, which is kind of frustrating because it should, or at least you think it should. But the problem is that key down happens like right before the value gets propagated up. So like we have the ability to grab the key code, but we have no longer the ability to grab the value. So what we need to do is we need to go back to input, but we also want to make sure validate works. So what we'll do is we have one specific directive, key down. We'll keep that because we need that for validation. And so we'll create a validate input for that specific key down. So key down will validate, and at input will format. So we'll move those two things, and all is great. So we have that validate input, and then we have that format input. And then another thing to note also is that because input is being formatted, each time input is updated, it has been formatted, so you need to unformat it to format it again. So there's like this back and forth that needs to happen. And that requires a remove fast util function, which is just like, you just grab everything and you undo any symbols that are within the string, because it's just anything that is not a number. So now we have all of our requirements checked, so all is well. So now we can move on to reactivity and how Vue ties into all of this. So here's our input that we want to create. And so I kind of cheated a little bit, because with reactivity, methods and directives are really key. And we already kind of talked about them. So we'll just kind of cover it really quickly. So we have the at input and at key down, which are directives. And then we have format input and validate input, which are methods. Why did I go up? Yes. So as you can see, you have that value, and then, whoa, this was too far. Oh, yes. Sorry about that. My slides keep moving. Stay. Okay, so the next thing, now that we've talked about methods, is to talk about computed properties. So computed properties is this idea that when a data property changes, a computed property is tied to that data property, so it updates itself. It's really useful for things like if you're filtering, if you're updating a format, which in this case you are. And so essentially what you're doing is you're binding to that value. So previously, we had the value attached to a data property. So formatted cash money was a data property. Except now, which is here, except now we're making formatted cash money a computed property instead of a data property, which means that we can move that formatting logic into that compute itself. So we have that data property. We're going to call it unformatted because it is unformatted. And then we're going to have this update event because that needs to happen for reactivity to work, so the formatting works, and all is well. So this is an example of what that looks like. So as I'm typing, the number updates as we want it to. So that's using computer properties with getters. And computer properties are by default getters, but you have the ability to also create a setter in a computer property. And so here I'm showing you what we did earlier, which is just a single getter property in computed. But we're going to move computed to be a getter and setter, which now allows us to refactor a lot of our code because we no longer have to do like an at input value anymore. We can just do a V model. What I mean by that is that, again, we have our formatted cash money as the V model, and then we have the getter, which is tied to a specific data property called formatted. And then we have a setter, I have a setter that sets that specific thing, so it's setting a data property, and then that data property is what the input is using as a V model. So to go back to the previous example, as you're typing, this is using a getter and a setter. As you're typing, is this big enough? As you're typing, you see that the decimal place is propagated. The thousands is not. I'll figure out why later. Demos. And so now that we have like a sense of how to build input masks, it's useful for us to figure out how we can take what we learned and make it reusable, because ultimately we're Vue developers, we don't like repeating ourselves, and we want to keep our code as simple and as clean as maintainable as possible. So what we built was an input, so it's a currency input. That's very specific though, because a lot of the times you might want to have a phone number input, maybe a date input, and so on. And so I'm going to call my thing, or I'm going to talk about this in a specific component manner. So because we're talking about a currency, I'm going to call it VDinero, because we're very international and we should not call it money, I guess. And so VDinero specifically deals with input masking for currency. And so that allows us to frame the perspective around what it does. The thing about it that we want to do is that VDinero has all of the logic within it. So all we talked about previously was the computers, the methods, the directives, all of that was bunched in with the actual presentational logic. The functionality was bunched in with the presentational part of the component. So a nice part of making something reusable is to make it renderless. What I mean by that is you have, let's say, a mask, and you can just pass in whatever properties you want within it. So here we have a specific, we're gonna use scope slots. So I know this is like new syntax and really confusing, but we'll go over this together. So we have vmask, and then we have a vslot, and the slot will grab specific parts that are within that component. So there's a formatted value, which is like what the formatted value looks like. And then we have event listeners, so input and key down, which are methods that we defined earlier. And then in the input, we'll just pass that from the slot to the child. So formatted value is whatever is within the slot, the parent component, and then it passes it through via the slot. And then we have these events, which is input and key down, and that those events can be used within the child component as well. So doing it this way means that your component no longer needs to know the implementation details of an input mask. It's able to just plug and play whatever you've created before. And you can actually take this further. So here you have input and key down. So the assumption is that there are only two, but sometimes there might be more events. Let's say you have a key press, you have a on change, and so on, and that can get really clunky because you have to define every single event as they happen. And so what we can do is we can just lump it into a listeners, and then we can just do v-on listeners, which is much easier than having to define like at input, then do this, at key down, then do this. So v-on listeners automatically binds all of the child listeners to the slot. So this is the definition of that renderless component I talked about. So we have vmask, and then all we're doing in the render function is we're returning a scope slots. And then within that, we're defining the data property that's within that component, so formatted. And then we're passing in an object of listeners. So here we can define however many listeners you want, and then the child or whatever is within the slot scope can just grab it as needed. So listeners is just generic. Another way of doing things that are reusable is using a v-mask. So like the previous example was a specific component. So you're using v-mask explicitly. So that component is like very clearly has to be used in that manner. But sometimes you might want an input, just like a generic input, and then you might want like to use a directive so you can explicitly pass in a string. So VDinero, which is what I showed, was specifically for currency. Assuming you want to do one for phone numbers and zip codes, you're gonna have to create multiple different components for those use cases, which can get annoying after a while because you're gonna have multiple components, you're gonna have to maintain all of them. So a directive might be a good way to go because it allows the user to pass in a specific string of characters that they want to be masked on top of an input, so v-mask. So that can be, here you're having phone numbers, it's a US-based phone number, so area code is in the parentheses and then everything else. And then you also can do dates, so month, date, year, or date, month, year. And so a directive is a really neat way to go. Directives are kind of heady, but really useful as well. Sarah Drasner wrote a really great post about directives where she talked about the different parts of it. So when you write a directive, you actually have custom hooks within a directive, which is bind, inserted, updated, component updated, and unbind. The ones that I actually really think most people care about is probably bind and maybe updated, and then unbind just removes the directive from the component. So bind is when the directive is first inserted into the element, And then component updated is whenever the component gets updated, then the directive changes as well. So for our use case, we're gonna just use those two. So like, don't have to think about all of them, just think about bind and component updated. So we'll define our directive, we'll call it mask, because it is a mask. And then within the bind, we'll define what needs to happen. So bind has access to two things. It has, I think more, but for now we're using two. So there's element, which is the actual element that it's bound to, and then it has an object of whatever the v-mask is, whatever is passed into v-mask. So value in this case is that string, which you see the hashes, the string of hashes, that is value. And so what I can do now is I can grab that value, which I'm gonna call mask, because that's clearer, and then I can do a where mask, which is a separate function, which takes a value and a mask and then puts them together so it is formatted for you. So this happens when the component is first when the directive is first added to a component. So let's say an input already has a value, then the mask will be applied to it on initial load. And then component updated happens whenever a user is typing. So it makes sure that when a user is typing, that mask gets reapplied as needed. So we're removing and then reapplying the mask. And again, it takes the similar parameters as bind, which is the element and then whatever object you pass into the directive. So here, for this to work, because we're still dealing with reactivity and Vue's reactivity system, we need Vue to know that the component is being updated. And in order to do this, we need to create a V model. So we're gonna create a data property called current mask. We'll create a V model on top of it that gives you automatic reactivity out of the box. So we can be happy because the example from all the way ago where we wanted to use V model but couldn't, now you can use V model if you use a directive, because V model gives you that two-way data binding and that reactivity, and then V mask allows you to hook into that reactivity and change the value as needed. And so this is the part that's kind of experimental, hooks. I think we're not calling it hooks, we're calling it hooks, but maybe we're calling it compositional functions. It's still unclear what it's being called, but it's essentially not React's way of doing things, but we'll walk through this a little bit more. So the idea behind hooks or compositional functions, or whatever we'll call it, hooks, is that it allows you to encapsulate state and logic without having a component or any presentational logic within it, which is really nice. It's similar to a mix-in, but if you listen to Evan's talk yesterday, mix-ins have issues in terms of namespacing and name clashes, which is kind of frustrating if you want to compose multiple mix-ins together. And so this is Evan approved, so it's a pattern worth using in your applications. So for the first, this is a two-parter, so bear with me. This is the first part, which is experimental Vue hooks, which like just saying it works now, but will not work probably in a month. It's just the way how software works. And so the nice thing about using hooks is that you still can use vModel. You don't have to do like an add input, an add key down, and so on. You can just use a vModel, and it works. Except it doesn't with Vue hooks, because for some reason, and I cannot tell you why, computed properties are not reactive in experimental Vue hooks. So that's a key thing to know if you plan on using this. Do not use it in production. Use it in talks, though, if you want to. And the idea is that you explicitly have to call a getter and a setter if you want that reactivity system to work. Again, I'm really not sure this is the way to write it. But what Vue hooks is doing is that you can grab the data and compute it, so it's like its own reactivity within itself. And then you define your hook as a function. So here I'm using a specific data, I'm calling it unformatted, so that's like any value that gets passed through, I'm assuming is unformatted. And then the computer takes that unformatted and formats it. That's pretty much it. So we're using a getter and a setter here. So a getter does a data.unformatted, so it grabs the data, it gives it to you, and then a setter sets that value for you with a mask. And then what you can do is you can return that computed property, because the state is internal to that hook. you only need to care about the computed. You don't have to care about like unformatted, which is the data within that component, within that hook. So yeah, so it's pretty fine. And so to use it, you would import the mask, and then within hooks, you would have to call the hook, and then you would have to extrapolate it using object destructuring to grab the specific computed. And then with that, you can do like formatted.get or formatted.set, which again, like maybe don't use that pattern because it's really experimental, probably will change. Actually, confirm plus chop will change. So according to Vue, this is a denied pattern, even though it kind of works. So from a demo perspective, it's great. A pattern that you might want to think about using in the future is Advanced Reactivity API. So that's going to come out, I assumed in Vue 3, but actually in 2.x, so very, very soon. And the way of using that is that you're grabbing the value in the computed, so very similar to what we had data in computed. You grab it from Vue Observer, and then you export a specific function, so we call it useComputeMask. We add in a data property, so value makes that data property reactive. And then within formatted, this is a computed. And so we have that getter and a setter. So the getter just grabs that value, and then the setter sets that value. There's nothing much different to it. It just looks a bit different. And then again, we return that specific computed property. And then to use it, it's actually way easier than like the experimental Vue hooks one, which is wrong. Because the idea is that you just need a single V model, and then all you have to do is in your data, you call that specific hook, and then you return it. And then you automatically have reactivity within your hook itself. So if you're really interested in learning more about this, the docs, there's an RFC as of yesterday. And so check it out because it's really cool, and there's like a lot of new things coming up, and it's worth like being a part of that discussion. So far, and all we've talked about is input events, how Vue can be used, or how Vue's reactivity system can be used, and how we can harness these patterns in a reusable manner. And so we talked about a lot. We talked about methods, we talked about computeds, directives, and so on. And if some of you are thinking like, wait, you didn't give me an answer for what I should build, well, the idea is that there's so many different ways of building one thing. There's no right answer. The idea and the best way of thinking about it is instead of thinking about which is the best tool, it's what is usable from a user perspective, what gives a better user experience, and perhaps what might be maintainable and sustainable from a developer perspective. What do you enjoy working on and building? And so with that, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And yeah, come find me afterwards.